So our job here today was to look at the ride height on this car and see if we were going to lower it down to the European specification. Now, this is something that a lot of people struggle with. They don't really understand it. Porsche makes it a little bit different. Porsche does not measure from fender heights. You can, but fender heights are not a very accurate way just because you can have a different height, and that can be a sheet metal issue, not an actual ride height issue. Now, we changed torsion bars in this car approximately 3 years ago. We did bushings in the back. All the front suspension is tight. This is a mandatory thing before making any changes. So we've recently had this car on the rack and checked wheel bearings. Everything else is good. Now, the next thing I've done is I've gone around and I've looked at tire pressures. Tire pressures will make a difference in measuring, because we are measuring from the ground up to torsion bar centers and to the wheel centers. So if you have a tire that is lower than the other side, that's going to change your measurements. So I've balanced all of the tire pressures. In the front, I have 2 bar, which is about 29 psi. In the rear, I have 2.4 bar, which is around 36 psi, and this is the factory spec on the tires. The other thing I've done is I looked at how much fuel was in the car, because the weight of fuel, whenever you're doing these measurements, you should be doing them with the full ride package. So that means a full tank of gas, all fluids topped off. That includes washer fluid as well. We're a little under a half a tank of gas, and also the factory toolkit is not with this car. So we've added weight to the car to compensate for this, and we're probably about 5 pounds more weight in the front than we should be, which to me is more realistic of a loaded car. Now, some people will weight the driver's side as well, because there's always a driver. Problem is what weight do you choose? So I find that if I set the car up the way it's supposed to be, the rest of it will kind of sort itself out. So when we are measuring ride height is calculated in the difference between the center of the wheel and the center of the torsion bar. And there are 2 settings for cars here in the United States. The US ride height is set about 1 inch higher than a standard European ride height. And this is so the cars could meet the US 5-mile-an-hour bumper impact rules. Now, it's a common choice for people here to lower their cars to the European ride height, which is taking about 1 inch out of it. If you go below that to achieve a look that you might desire, you've got to be careful, because all of these are design dimensions. The suspension is designed to work within a usable range. When you start going outside of that usable range, you can run into issues with wheel alignment factors, not being able to get the desired factors, tire wear issues, scraping the bottom of the car. I mean, I've seen some cars that have literally been 1 inch off the ground, and I've also had to change transmission cases because they have literally worn the bottom out of the diff housing because the car is so low. These are all things you want to consider. So it doesn't matter if you start in the front or in the rear. I typically start in the rear once everything is balanced. And I'm going to take my measurement from the ground up to the bottom of my torsion bar housing. I use the bottom because it's a lot more accurate. I know the torsion bar housing is 45 millimeters in diameter. So I add 22.5 millimeters to my dimension, and that's my actual center. When I measure from the ground to the center of the wheel, I will also do it without the hubcaps on, and I'll measure to the top and bottom of the hubcap hole, split the difference, and add it back into my lowest measurement, and that gives me my wheel center. Once you've measured one wheel, as long as the tires and the rims front and back are exactly the same, or in the case of a wider rim on the rear than the front, that the tire profiles have been adjusted so the roll radius is the same, then you don't have to measure every single wheel. Once I've got my rear torsion bar heights and wheel heights, I'll move to the front. The front, and you want to be doing this on flat level ground. If you have a 4-poster rack, it makes it a lot easier so you're not crawling around on the ground. And we're going to do the same thing in the front. We're going to measure from the ground to the center of the torsion bar heights on both sides.
284 millimeters.
Okay, so as always, first thing I want to do is look at my specifications, and here's where we can see the difference. So for rear height, the difference between torsion bar centers is 37 millimeters plus or minus 5 millimeters. On a Euro spec car, the difference between torsion bar and wheel centers is 12 millimeters. So you can see right here, it's pretty much 25 millimeters is going to be the difference in ride height, which is exactly an inch. And the number that we're looking for is going to be the Euro spec, which is 12 millimeters plus or minus 5 in the rear. So the way that we get here, on my rear left, I have 283 millimeters from the concrete to the bottom of my torsion tube plus 22.5 millimeters. That gives me a center at 305.5 millimeters. If I take my 305.5 minus 296, which is my wheel center right there, equals our ride height is 9.5 millimeters on the rear left. If we do the same on the right rear, we have 306.5 minus 296. We have a ride height of 10.5 millimeters. So right now we are within a millimeter side to side, which is great. Maximum permissible difference is 8 millimeters in the rear. And when we look at our Euro spec, the maximum difference is plus or minus 5 millimeters. So we are well within the range of all of those dimensions. And we're actually on the lower side of the ride height by about 2.5, 3 millimeters total. So right now, the rear of this car is sitting right at the Euro spec. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing for the front. And already we can see in our numbers here, this is for the front left. I have 187 millimeters. And I measured this before and after. You can see here, this is how I got to my added weight in the front of the car. We have approximately 10.6 gallons missing from the tank to be a full tank. That comes up to, with high octane fuel, that should weigh around 6.3 pounds per gallon. That equals 66.78 missing pounds. We added an extra 10 pounds to that just to allow for missing tools. So that actually ends up with, let's say, round numbers, 77 pounds. We have added approximately 80 pounds of weight. And that's just because we had two 40-pound bags of pellets, and it makes it easy. I'm okay with the 3-pound deviation. This number brought the front suspension, or brought the front of the car down approximately 5 millimeters. When I measured previously, it was 5 millimeters higher. So this does make a difference. We're going to do the same thing with subtracting the numbers. So we're going to have 296 minus 187. Equals, this one equals a ride height of 109, and 296 minus 192, ride height of 104. So if we look at our shop information, 911 and 911 Carrera Euro spec is 108 millimeters plus or minus 5 millimeters with a maximum difference side to side of 5 millimeters. So we're looking for this 108 number. We have 109 on this side, and what we're measuring, this one's actually a really clean drawing of it that you can make sense. We're taking this measurement here and this measurement here up to the center lines, and we're actually measuring this difference here. So you'll notice on a USA car, the difference is 93 millimeters, And that's because the wheel stays constant the whole time. It's not going to change in size, but it moves the body up the more tension we put on the torsion bar. So this dimension is going to get smaller as the car is raised. So technically, we're within the 5 millimeters, but the front right on this one, we're actually going to wind it down because the adjustment is very simple, very quick, and we can balance the car to make sure that we're at that same 109. If we really wanted to, we could wind it up a millimeter to take this one to 108, and then we would wind this one down 4 millimeters, so this one would come up to 108, and this one would come down to 108, just to balance the car out. So what I've done is I've just set my tape measure for the height that I wanted to see, and I've just dropped it down about a full turn. That was 4 quarter turns. I'm going to go bounce on the car and let it settle. Okay, make sure my setting's good, which it is. Perfect. Let's go look at the other side. On this side we want to come up. Okay. Looks good. Okay, I'm just going to bounce it again. Nice. Okay, so we're just going to show the difference in measuring from the ground to a fender. Now, I know the car is balanced. Measuring from the torsion bars on a flat level ground, I know that we're 100%. Right now, when I measure, we are within 2 millimeters side to side, which is nice and tight. It's the closer you get it, the better the car will handle. But just to show you the difference with measuring fender heights, and these numbers really mean nothing because different fenders can mean different things. So right here on the left front, we're approximately 680, maybe 81 millimeters. Versus the right front, it's about 5 millimeters higher. It's 685, 86. So it's showing a 5 millimeter difference side to side. Now this can play into looks, but it really is just that, looks. Okay, on the rear, we are measuring, we get in the center-ish, we are measuring 665 millimeters from the ground up to the fender. Versus about 659, so about 6 millimeters difference from side to side, when we know measuring to the torsion bar housing that this is within a millimeter side to side. So just a visual, it can tell you if you have some body issues. Obviously you have to be on flat level ground. Another thing to consider, if the car has been on a rack or jack stands and the suspension has been hanging down for any length of time, you do need to drive the car before you take any measurements. Just putting the car back on the ground and bouncing a couple of times is not enough to settle all the suspension bushings. I would say drive it at least 5 to 10 miles. Normal driving, don't have to go crazy, but just get everything riding to where it needs to be before you start doing this process. One last point that I want to touch on. We did the suspension bushings in both trailing arms and torsion bar pivot bushings for the spring plates, as well as a new set of 26 millimeter torsion bars in this car about 3 years ago. In the last 3 years, it's traveled about 8,000 miles, as best as we can tell, looking at our mileage records. And one of the things that we did then is we set it up to the USA spec. So it's about an inch higher than the car is sitting right now. So when it comes to suspension, things will settle. So when you put in new parts, the car is going to change slightly. And in this case, the car is actually settled in very nicely onto the European ride height. We haven't made any adjustments other than the adjustment that we just made in the front to do some fine tuning. And I mean, the car is still balanced like it was when it left here in the back. So all we can say is things will change. Usually it's a one-off thing to recheck your ride heights if you have an issue. But just something to keep in the back of your mind. A first setting with all new parts will take a little bit of wear in time, will have some settling. So don't be surprised if once you do all your work and you set everything up, everything's running nice, in 3 or 4 years' time, you may need to recheck and do some fine adjustments to the car.